Okay, we've probably all heard the story of Esther from the Bible, right? Yes, you would agree? Okay, but have you ever stopped to think about how culture impacts our understanding of the Bible, and specifically the story of Esther? I don't know if you have, but before I did this study, I hadn't thought a lot about how culture truly impacts our understanding of the story and makes a difference in what meaning we can pull from the word that the Lord has given us. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the culture of Esther, specifically the story of Esther, a little bit of history, some intercultural communication principles, as well as some personal applications. So first of all, let's look at the key players from the book of Esther. You have King Xerxes, Queen Vashti, Esther, Mordecai, and Haman. Now, of course, these are the main characters, and there's several others, and because I'm sure most of you are pretty familiar with the story of Esther, I won't go into too much detail, but just a brief overview. King Xerxes was the ruler over 127 provinces. His wife was Queen Vashti, and he ordered her to come before him at a banquet, and she refused. After she refused, he banished her, exiled her from the kingdom. Soon thereafter, he got lonely and asked for all the beautiful women in the kingdom to come into his palace. Well, Esther was the most beautiful of all the women, and so he chose her to be his wife. And later on in the story, he appoints one of his officials, Haman. Now, Haman is kind of the evil villain of the story. Haman eventually comes to plot to kill all of the Jews, only because Mordecai, who is Esther's cousin, would not bow before him. So we'll get into a little more detail of that later. But basically, the story wraps up with Esther going before the king and requesting that her people be saved. And of course, if you know the ending of the story, all ends well, and the Jews are able to save their people, and the Lord triumphs. Let's talk specifically about some history behind the story of Esther. The plot is set during the reign of the Persian king Xerxes I, as we already said, who ruled from 486 to 465 BC. But according to Carol Bechtel in her book, The Interpretation, a Bible Commentary for Teaching and Preaching, Esther was not actually written until 80 years after that time. So it's important to note here that it may not have been written right when it was happening, written more of a story after the fact. And according to Kay Daigle in her teaching series For Such a Time as This, the Persians conquered the Babylonians, and it is this Persian period of the empire during which the story takes place. Now, after the Israelite exile of 70 years, a few of the Jews returned to their land with Persian approval. So that's why Mordecai and his cousin Esther were living in Persia at this time. The sad fact is that the majority of God's people chose to remain in the land of their captivity instead of relocating to God's promised land. So those are just a couple of important things to note as we talk about the culture of Esther. Now, the first mention of culture is in Esther 2, verse 10. This is a New International Version. It said, Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. And in the Matthew Henry Bible Commentary, it tells us that Esther was born in Shushan and her parents were dead. So Mordecai took her in as his own daughter, took care of her, and raised her in this Persian culture. But when she went to the palace, Mordecai instructed her not to tell them that she was actually a Jew. Now, this will be important to the story a little bit later. A second instance of culture we see is in Esther 3, verse 2, which says, all the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. Now, you may be thinking, what does this really have to do with culture? Well, when you first read this, you might think that this is just a civil bowing, sort of, as you bow before a king, or if you would acknowledge the president in America. But according to the way that these things are written, and according to John Wesley's Bible Commentary, this was actually a divine type of honor that they were requesting. So by Mordecai not bowing down, he was actually fulfilling the Ten Commandments and saying, I will not bow to any idol besides the Lord. This was not just acknowledging that Haman was one of the officials, but really giving him some sort of deity that Mordecai felt he did not deserve. This is often overlooked when we talk about the story of Esther, because we talk about Esther and how she went before the king and how important that was, which is so true. But it's also important to note that Mordecai was fulfilling what the Lord called him to do, very similar to the story earlier in the Old Testament of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when they would not bow and the Lord saved them from the fire. We see the same thing here when the Jews were saved because Mordecai would not bow, and also because of Esther's boldness. So let's talk a little bit about some communication principles that we can apply to the book of Esther. First, acculturation. Now, according to Hall in his book, Among Cultures, The Challenge of Communication, acculturation refers to the process of becoming communicatively competent in a culture we have not been raised in. Now, this is important because Esther, although she was raised for half of her life in the Persian Empire, was a Jew. And when she went into the kingdom, no one even knew that she was a Jew. Now, this is really interesting because it plays into the whole plot of the story. And acculturation is so important for Esther. Had she not had this principle and not been able to acculturate with the Persian culture, she certainly would not have had the same type of impact that she did if she was just someone from another culture coming in. She certainly would not have been chosen as queen. Now, the second cultural principle is that of power distance. Now, according to William Goody Kunst in his book, Cross-Cultural and Intercultural Communication, power distance is the extent to which the less powerful members of institutions and organizations accept that power is distributed unequally. Now, if you think about your culture and where we live today, we live in America. Our culture is not very extreme in power distance. Everyone's treated fairly equally according to our Constitution. Doesn't matter what your race, your gender, your background, or even your status in society, you are to be treated the same. That was not true in this culture. And this plays a huge impact on the understanding of the story because Esther went before the king to ask for something. She went to say, I need my people to be saved. Will you save this? But if you understand how the book was written and understanding of the power distance in this culture, Esther actually risked her life by going before the king to request this. It was said that if the king did not summon you and you went on your own accord, you could be put to death. So it's important to understand that the Persian culture was very high in power distance. Now let's talk about culture today. Esther 9 verses 26 through 27 says, "Therefore these days were called Purim, from the word pure. The Jews took it upon themselves to establish the custom that they and their descendants and all who joined them should without fail observe these 2 days every year and the way prescribed at the time appointed." Now, according to Rich, in an article entitled Purim, pure actually means lots, and it stands for the lots that Haman was casting to try to decide which day of the year he was going to kill the Jews. Now, today, I didn't know this, but today Jews still celebrate this holiday 1 month before the Passover. So they bake these little cookies in a triangle shape here to represent Haman's hat and how he was overthrown. And it said that the entire book of Esther is read, and every time the name of Haman is mentioned, they boo and hiss and stamp their feet. So this is often referred to in America as the Jewish Mardi Gras. So that's how this culture is still impacting us today. So what can we learn from this book and from culture in the book of Esther? Well, culture does not limit God. According to Chuck Swindoll in his book, A Woman of Strength and Dignity, Esther, as we learned in our study of Esther's story, his hand moves invisibly yet with invincibility, bringing his sovereign plan to completion. It includes haunting delays that seem unfair, human decisions that lack compassion, harmful deeds that bring others to question God's goodness. Nevertheless, he pursues with persistence and he refuses to be distracted. In the end, God wins. What great comfort that brings. And I think this is so interesting because as we look at culture in the Bible, it's very different from the way that our culture is today. But understanding these cultural principles, the communication principles, as well as the way that culture functioned in their day and time, gives us a better understanding of what we can pull from the book of Esther and what we can apply for our lives. So I'll talk to you a little bit about the story of Esther, the history of Esther, some intercultural communication principles, and some personal applications that you can apply in your own life. And hopefully you have a better understanding of how culture impacts our understanding of the Bible. Thank you.